Welcome to Finding Medina, Episode 11, Terror in Texas. I'm Brandon Seal. Quote, "It isn't easy to put on paper what this town suffered, or even to narrate with much certainty exactly what happened after the battle, because so many of those who could have borne true witness to those events have died, and many of the rest took part in the oppression and tyranny of their own countrymen, and thus will not tell the truth." End quote. So begins the only Spanish-language contemporary account that we have of the Battle of Medina and its aftermath. A warning here before I begin. This is the only episode that I've ever marked as explicit in all my history of podcasting, which is saying something since I've covered already dozens of battles, tens of thousands of deaths, and a fair number of gruesome executions. This episode takes things to a different level, unfortunately, but I'd feel remiss not including it, because the aftermath of the Battle of Medina is probably more important than the battle itself. Indeed, I'll argue that Tejano's response to the horrors that followed the battle will come to define the course of Texas history over the next generation and well beyond. So although I think most people should listen to this episode, if you're listening with small children, be warned that it details some fairly shocking acts and contains some foul language quoted from the primary sources. Following their rout at the Battle of Medina, Republican survivors scattered in all directions. Those with families rushed back to San Antonio as quickly as they could. There, they gathered their loved ones and what belongings they could carry on their backs and fled. San Antonio lost almost 1,000 inhabitants overnight. Some sought refuge with their Native American allies in the hill country, where they knew Spaniards wouldn't dare venture. Others, including the Navarros, Ruiz, Delgados, and Arrochas, fled east toward Louisiana. The Navarros and Ruiz made it there, ultimately settling near Natchitoches. The Delgados and Arrochas weren't so lucky. Immediately after the battle, Arredondo had dispatched Colonel Elizondo to pursue the fleeing families. Elizondo and his troop caught up with the Delgados and Arrochas as they were crossing the flood-swollen Trinity River. Quote, "Halt, rebels, traitors to your king," end quote, the Royalists shouted as they surrounded the exhausted refugees. Before the refugees could respond, however, the Royalists fired. In particular, they seemed to concentrate their fire on a man they probably recognized as one of the principal officers of the Republican Army of the North, and, more notoriously, as the executioner of the captured Spanish officers after the Battle of Rosillo. Their shots found their mark. Captain Antonio Delgado fell instantly to the ground, dead before he hit it. His mother rushed over to him, screaming at Elizondo that her son should have been allowed to confess. Quote, "He can confess himself to the devil," end quote, Elizondo responded. Delgado's lifeless body was ripped away from his mother, stripped nude, and left for the beast to consume. A general slaughter of another 70 or so Republican refugees followed. Some threw themselves into the river to escape Royalist vengeance, but the record notes only 3 brave young women who survived that desperate measure. Most of the rest were marched back to San Antonio in chains. A couple of days after the battle, call it August 20th, 1813, General Arredondo and the main body of the Royalist army entered San Antonio. More accurately, his army sacked San Antonio. There was light resistance at first. Some of the women in particular who had stayed behind took potshots at the invaders as they came into town. This may have only provoked the Royalists further, who even before arriving in San Antonio referred to the townsfolk as canalla, scoundrels. Several hundred San Antonio men holed themselves up in San Fernando Church and tried to claim sanctuary. Arredondo recognized no such concept for, quote, traitors of God, end quote, as he called the Republicans, and had these men unceremoniously removed from the church. He then imprisoned them all for the night in a small granary where somewhere between 8 and 18 of them died from suffocation. Now that the town had been rendered defenseless, quote, homes were invaded, and where resistance was offered, the defenders were butchered on their own threshold in the presence of their horrified families. The women, and even tender girls, mere children, were outraged, and in numerous instances, cruelly murdered and their nude bodies dragged into the street. End quote. Sadly, this first Noche Triste, as San Antonians would refer to it for decades afterward, marked only the beginning of their suffering. It wasn't long before the captured Delgados, Arrochas, and other refugees from the Trinity River were marched into the now subjugated city. These captives must have surely known the fate that awaited them as they marched into the city center of their own town, along streets lined with the limbs and heads of earlier victims of Royalist vengeance. Still, as they entered the Plaza de Armas, they must have been surprised to see Arredondo himself awaiting them there, eye patch and all. And they must have been even more surprised when he started singing back to them a little camp ditty that they had composed in the heady months after they had routed Colonel Elizondo at the Battle of Alazan Creek. Quote, Ahí viene el tuerto Arredondo a pelear con los de Texas. Pensará que son ovejas de las que trajo Elizondo. End quote. Here comes old one-eyed Arredondo, come to mess with the Texans. He must think that we're sheep, like the soldiers he sent with Elizondo. Por Dios, Arredondo said to them now, how Elizondo's sheep had become lions. The original song apparently ended with a promise on the part of the singers to barbecue Arredondo's balls and eat them. Arredondo offered a different option to the prisoners approaching him now. They could suck his balls raw, right here, he told them. These were among the last words that these prisoners would hear before they were marched to confession, executed, dismembered, and their heads placed in iron cages in the Plaza de Armas for all to see. Yet even still, this didn't satisfy Arredondo's bloodlust. He continued to ratchet up the horror. Each morning, he ordered 3 men yanked from prison, lined them up against the wall, and shot them, presumably to try and elicit information from them about their compatriots. Well, it apparently didn't work. He repeated this gruesome ritual for nearly 3 months. By his own account, he executed 327 civilians during this period. Yet at least death came quick and clean for the men. A different, crueler fate awaited the women. As soon as he had entered San Antonio, Arredondo had rounded up the wives and children of known Republicans and imprisoned them in the largest building in town, known as La Quinta. There, he forced his captives to grind 24 bushels of corn every day to make tortillas for the very soldiers who were daily murdering their men. Arredondo worked them from 2 in the morning until 10 at night, every night. They hulled boiled corn until their feet blistered and their toenails fell out, quote, their living blood mixing with the corn they hulled, end quote. When the poor women prayed to God for mercy, their jailer would taunt them, quote, I am your God, putas. I am the God of whores, end quote. Yet the women fought back. Some had perhaps participated in the battle itself. Gertrudis de los Santos, Petra Benítez, Josefa Hinojosa, Juana de la Garza, Gertrudis Montes, and Josefa Santos are all listed amongst insurgents on a property confiscation list published by Arredondo soon after the battle, though we aren't told the exact nature of their participation in the insurgency. Even after they were imprisoned, the women continued engaging in small-scale acts of defiance until Arredondo and his jailers raised the stakes. They ordered all the imprisoned children cast out into the streets, without food, without shelter, yet within earshot of their anguished mothers. The details of these pitiful children's suffering really is almost too awful to imagine. The banished children huddled around the perimeter of the La Quinta building, whimpering and weeping, inadvertently doubling their mother's suffering. Through the walls, they asked their mothers what they should do to survive. All their mothers could say to them was to go beg for alms and to pray for the mercy of strangers. Yet even sympathetic townsfolk, whom these children may have considered friends in earlier times, were too intimidated by Arredondo's program of terror to openly help these children. And so, like the women in La Quinta, the children simply suffered and nearly starved. One breastfeeding baby actually died within sight of its mother, who was forbidden to feed it. And of course, on top of all this, the women in La Quinta were insulted, assaulted, and systematically raped on a daily basis. When one night they tried to resist their jailer's nightly visits by locking arms with each other, the chief jailer dragged the organizer of the resistance out into the street, stripped her bare, and indulged his appetites in front of the entire town. And yet still, the women continued resisting. Quote, sufriendo nuestras heroínas con firmeza y constancia, end quote. As Brian Stauffer, my co-translator of this anonymous Spanish-language account, pointed out to me, the author of this account repeatedly returns to this type of language, referring to these women as heroic, firm, constant, patriots, insurgents, and citizens even, words typically reserved for men in this period. By contrast, but also as confirmation, these Tejana's jailers mocked these women for their toughness by ascribing it to a lack of femininity, citing in particular their penchant for shooting pistols at Royalists and for straddling pommeled saddles instead of riding side saddle. One day, the still unimprisoned Josefa Arrocha of the prominently Republican Arrocha family told Arredondo to his face that she would skin his belly and make a drum out of it. When, as a consequence, he ordered her off to the horrors of La Quinta, she accused him of being too cowardly to just shoot her. Apparently, she wasn't wrong. Arredondo didn't shoot her, he just sent her off to La Quinta. On a different occasion, when Arredondo struck another woman with the broadside of his sword for complaining about her plight, she, quote, sprang at him like a tigress, end quote, and demanded a sword of her own to duel Arredondo to the death. He declined. She, however, repeated her demand, this time proposing that she do it with her hands behind her back to make it fair. These were unimaginably tough women. For 54 days, they endured the ordeal of La Quinta and the separation from their children. At last, sometime in late October, we suppose, General Arredondo ordered the women of La Quinta released. It would still be many more months, May of 1814 to be precise, and that only after the pleading of the otherwise not particularly soft-hearted Zambrano brothers, that Arredondo allowed locals to even bury the body parts that were still strung up around Main Plaza. The trauma that the aftermath of the Battle of Medina inflicted on the citizens of San Antonio can't be overstated. Dan Arellano calls it a form of collective post-traumatic stress disorder, something which Bradley Folsom covers at length in his recently published biography of Arredondo. Yet the really unfathomable part of all this is that everything we've just heard was simply the opening of a nearly decade-long parade of misfortunes that befell San Antonio. To start with, Arredondo had of course confiscated all Republican San Antonians' possessions, some 62,642 pesos worth of assets, the better part of the private wealth of San Antonio. Then, a series of droughts and pestilences in 1814, combined with the burden of supporting Arredondo's occupying Royalist force, created acute food shortages. By 1817, San Antonians were eating rats and leather just to survive. And with San Antonio's civilians disarmed by Arredondo, and his soldiers uninterested in patrolling the plains, Indian attacks proliferated. Arredondo, eventually had to order the ranches outside of town abandoned. The untended and unprotected ranches and fields surrounding San Antonio were soon, quote, putrid with the flesh of livestock slaughtered by Indians. Though these attacks seemed suspiciously concentrated on Royalist targets, the environment of fear and scarcity ultimately affected everyone. Then, as if to prove that when it rains, it pours, on June 5th, 1819, San Antonio suffered one of the worst floods in its history. Floodwaters swept away 55 dwellings and killed 19 inhabitants. San Antonio was collapsing in on itself, like the decaying carcasses and rotting produce in its fields. By 1819, the non-Indian population of Texas had fallen to its lowest level in more than half a century. When the Spanish viceroy ordered Arredondo to reform a government for San Antonio, he responded matter-of-factly that there were no men left to fill the offices. The issue wasn't raised again. Despite our difficulties today in finding the so-called forgotten battlefield of Medina, General Arredondo in 1813 wanted to make sure that San Antonians would never forget it. For almost a decade, he forbade the families of the Republican dead from burying the bones of their loved ones, which decorated the Laredo roads south of the Medina River like morbid highway markers. But maybe Arredondo's last revenge can help lead us to the battlefield. Maybe, instead of trying to deduce subtle topographical clues from the muddled, adrenaline-obscured, and possibly misremembered accounts of men writing 50 years after the battle, we should instead look to the more casual observations of those who saw the unmistakable evidence of the battlefield in the years that followed. And we actually have at least 5 people claiming to have seen the battlefield after the battle. The first is Stephen F. Austin, and the second is Pedro Walker, both of whom we discussed at length in episode 6. Recall, both Austin's maps and Walker's diary indicate a concentration of bones at roughly 7 miles south of the Medina River along the Laredo Road. Now, we're still not perfectly clear which road is the Laredo Road, but we do know more or less which were the main 2 crossings of the Medina River at that time. And incidentally, when you draw 7-mile arcs from each of these crossings, they end up in about the same place. Our third source is José Antonio Navarro, a teenager at the time of the battle. As a contemporary and as a frequent traveler, Navarro would have known for certain where the battle occurred, and in fact says as much in his own memoirs, claiming that the battle ended with a running massacre for, quote, 6 miles, end quote, back to the Medina River. If his location is 6 miles from the Medina, on the same Laredo Road, he's not far from Austin and Walker's 7 miles. Fourth, we actually have another account that makes reference to the field of battle being 6 miles from the Medina. Do you remember James Gaines? He was one of the first and most reliable recruiters of men to Gutierrez de Lara's cause. He had led the Native American contingent during the Battle of Rocio, and was later sent by Gutierrez de Lara back to Louisiana to try to counter Toledo's smear campaign against him there. Following Gutierrez de Lara's ouster, Gaines never made it back to the Republican Army of the North, thus sparing him the fate of his comrades. He did return to Texas, however, in 1819, and soon thereafter was elected alcalde of Nacogdoches. He was also present in 1822 when a new Mexican governor arrived, Governor José Félix Tres Palacios. One of Tres Palacios' first orders of business was to venture out and finally bury the bones of the Republican fallen. Gaines tells the story as follows in the third person. Quote, in 1822, when coming to San Antonio at the head of the Durango Regiment to take possession as governor, Tres Palacios was accompanied by Captain Gaines. When at the lake 6 miles from Medina, where the Patriots were defeated in 1813, Tres Palacios asked Captain Gaines if he would assist in doing honor to the bones of his brave countrymen. End quote. So there's that 6 miles again, just like Navarro had said, and awfully close to Austin and Walker's number. But notice what else Gaines says. He refers to a, quote, lake 6 miles from the Medina, end quote. And this is the first time we've heard of this lake. Or is it? I'll ask you to try to recall here my fifth and final contemporary account of the battlefield, which we reviewed in episode 5, written by Antonio Menchaca, a cousin to the commander of the Tejano forces in the battle, Miguel Menchaca. Menchaca summarized Arredondo's movements before the battle as follows, quote, Arredondo, also coming to a place he considered advantageous to his purpose, stopped at the waterholes called Charcos de las Gallinas, on the hill this side of the Atascoso Creek, and about 5 miles from the Medina River, end quote. Charcos, in Spanish, means little ponds, or watering holes, as they're rendered here. Places in a creek bed, for example, where water pools. Gaines calls it a lake. Menchaca calls it a charco, but I think they're talking about the same place. There's just not that many places in the incredibly sandy Encinal de Medina where water collects and stays on the surface. In some way, shape, or form, it seems that everything in San Antonio history always comes back to water, so it's no surprise that we should be returning to it now. In particular, water dictated where and how armies marched through South Texas. Arredondo wouldn't have deviated too far away from water on the day of the battle. The Republicans, by contrast, paid dearly for straying too far from it. Several of the battle accounts make it sound like they were making one last push toward a known or suspected water body when they stumbled into Arredondo's force, waiting for them perhaps right along a stream bed from which they could have easily drawn water to cool their own cannons and water their horses. It would have been as good a place as any for Arredondo to have made his stand before a thirsty, oncoming Republican horde. And so where is that spot today? Well, it's right in the middle of a sand mining operation, just a couple miles upstream of where Kathy Brown and her siblings used to fish their little iron marbles out of Las Gallinas Creek. Those Tejanos who fled after the Battle of Medina didn't give up the fight for independence just because they were in exile. Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara settled in New Orleans, where he participated on January 8, 1815, in another Young Republic's fight against her old mother country. Then again, it might have been simpler than that. Texas Indians might simply have been fighting for their freedom from a distant foreign power attempting to claim authority over them, which again makes them not terribly dissimilar to their Tejano allies. When Mexico finally won her independence in 1821, it was a deeply unsatisfying event for Mexican Republicans. Mexican independence came about not as the result of any great victory by a revolutionary army. There was no Mexican Yorktown, for example. But rather, it came about as the result of the appropriation of the cause of independence by the Mexican Royalist faction, when their beloved monarch back in Spain became too liberal, too Republican. Mexican Royalists simply replaced the Spanish king with a homegrown Mexican emperor, Agustín Iturbide. Independence thus triumphed. Self-government, however, did not. This further meant that there would be no day of reckoning for the old opponents of Mexican independence. After 10 years of costly and savage civil war, the new Mexican empire could ill afford an uprising from recalcitrant Royalist generals, particularly ones with independent power bases and armies. And so, in the name of unity and peace, General Arredondo, along with many other Royalist officers of the old regime, was allowed to hold on to his old post in exchange for simply pledging his allegiance to the new, independent Mexican Empire. Even after Mexican revolutionaries in Morelos and Veracruz had laid down their arms, however, one place remained stubbornly unpacified. Republican refugees and their Native American allies in Texas showed little inclination to make peace with their old enemies, no matter what the new, supposedly independent Mexican government said. Tejanos had little reason to expect that the grievances they had raised in their 1813 Declaration of Independence would be addressed by the new government, particularly when the most visible representative of that new government in Texas was the same man who had been their most aggressive persecutor for most of the previous decade. The new Mexican government ordered Arredondo to seek peace along the frontier, however, whatever it took. In an attempt to convince Republican refugees to come back to Texas and lay down their arms, Arredondo slowly and begrudgingly began to issue pardons to old Republicans. The Veramendis, Navarros, and Seguins came back. So too did many Arrochas and Delgados. None of them would ever recover all of the property that had been taken from them by the Royalists, despite the fact that the cause they had been fighting for had, nominally, prevailed. There was one man, however, whom Arredondo could not bring himself to pardon: José Francisco Ruiz. Sometimes, when we tell the story of the Battle of Medina, we tell it as though it marked the end of the battle against Spanish rule in Texas. But Ruiz's example reminds us how the fight went on. And by 1822, Ruiz had been making Arredondo's life hell now for almost a decade by helping coordinate ongoing Native American raids against the Spanish in Texas. At one point, Arredondo had placed a 9,000 peso bounty on Ruiz's head, though to no effect. Ruiz was the problem that Arredondo couldn't ignore and couldn't seem to work around. Eventually, the one-eyed Spaniard swallowed his pride and reached out to Ruiz with an offer. Arredondo promised Ruiz a pardon and a commission in the regular Mexican army if he could negotiate a peace with the Apaches and Comanches. It took Ruiz less than a year to do what Arredondo hadn't been able to do in almost a decade. In the second half of 1822, in the first half of 1823, Ruiz led separate delegations of Apaches and Comanches to sign peace treaties all the way in Mexico City, far away from Arredondo's center of power in the north of Mexico, it should be noted. These treaties, with the Apaches and Comanches, signed 2 years after the War of Mexican Independence had concluded, formalized the end of hostilities in Texas. Once peace had been established, however, the new central government returned to the old central government's approach to governing Texas by neglecting it. In 1825, San Antonio had to take over responsibility for its own defense again. Most of the regular Mexican army forces had been pulled back into the center of the country, and the conscripts that the government offered to send were more often than not convicts seeking to avoid jail time. By the late 1820s, the unit stationed in the Alamo in San Antonio was composed almost entirely of San Antonians. And too often, the unit had to be funded entirely by San Antonians as well. As in 1822, when the unit's new commander, Lieutenant Colonel José Francisco Ruiz, had to reach out to his cousin, José Antonio Navarro, to form the first bank in Texas to help cover the payroll of his soldiers. All that being said, by 1824, some sense of normalcy was returning to Texas. There was even cause for optimism, as Republican rebels integrated themselves back into the mainstream of society. José Antonio Navarro was back to importing goods from Louisiana, speculating in land, and getting himself elected to various city, state, and federal offices. His brother, Ángel Navarro, who had initially held a commission in the Royalist Army, before being run off because of the rest of his family's known Republican sympathies, well, Angel had been restored to good standing too, and emerged as a leading citizen of San Antonio. The Navarro's brother-in-law and fellow refugee Juan Martín de Veramendi won election as an alternate to the 1823 Mexican Constitutional Convention and as a delegate to the Coahuila Constitutional Convention of 1827, beginning his ascent through the ranks of Coahuilan politics that would see him made governor in 1832. And the San Antonio City Council, essentially the only government in the entire province of Texas, selected rancher and former rebel Erasmo Seguin to represent the state at the 1823 Mexican Constitutional Convention. His charge from the city council was brief, broad, and unequivocal: to ensure a, quote, federal, republican form of government, end quote. Yet just a decade later, in 1834, Tejano's dream of self-government and of moving past the trauma of 1813 would be dashed again by yet another tyrant who had actually learned his craft as an officer in Arredondo's army in 1813. On the next Finding Medina. Thank you for listening. On the Rivard Report webpage for this episode, I've uploaded a running list of names that I've been compiling of all known Republican participants in the Battle of Medina. For this, I want to especially thank our old friend Fred Martinez for passing me Arredondo's prescription list, enumerating 96 San Antonio insurgents whose property he ordered confiscated. And I'd also like to thank David McKenzie, a researcher at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. He's actually writing his PhD dissertation about U.S. citizens who migrated to Mexico between 1822 and 45, including many with connections to this battle. But go check out the list that I published there and see if you see a family name. It's a sampling of the continent at the time, names in Spanish, English, French, and perhaps others. Editing for this episode was performed by Susana Canseco, sound engineering by Stephen Bennett. A special thanks to my friend George Gaitan for letting us use his music on this series. You can find out more about him at georgegaitan.tripod.com. Thanks to my SWCA research buddies, Crystal Allgood, Rob Lakowitz, and Zachary Overfield, as well as to former San Antonio City archaeologist Kay Hines. Thanks to Brian Stauffer, our unofficial Old Spanish document transcriber, to Samantha Alanis, our cartographer-in-chief, to Cesar Gutierrez, our unofficial Archivo General de la Nación researcher, and to UTSA's Dean of Libraries, Dean Hendricks, our all other document finder. And for more information about our podcast and other projects, check out www.brandonseal.com.